We do have a little bit of time for Q&A. And I know if you have a class, or you have to feed your cat, or you have your work, that's fine. But if you're gonna hang around, feel free. We have time for about 10 or 15 minutes of questions. And what I'll do is, if you wanna come ask a question, it might be better to do that with a microphone, but if you talk loud, you could go for it too. Anybody have a question or a comment? Definitely I would say thank you for sharing that. It's just, there's beautiful things, there's hard things, but at the same time it's probably not the reality you're seeing on the news, most likely, or hearing in the news, by someone who's dedicated their life to telling a story that's a whole picture story, right? Anybody, any comments, questions? Yeah, go for her.
How did you deal with not being able to help people?
Well, it's in the white paper of the National Press Photographers Association. How did I feel about it? Yeah, I did feel I could change lives with a $5 bill if I so chose. But the reality of it, and it may sound harsh, was all of these people on the roads most traveled have done that voluntarily. They may or may not have known what they were going to get into, but they definitely had an impression or a dream or a hope of what they might find, which was better than what they left behind. So I couldn't help, I wouldn't help, and I explained to them, but I won't help you, but I won't hinder you either. It was really hard. The little boy who got his head bashed in, yeah, that was okay by me. Yeah, to help him.
Yeah, and that reminds me of the classic scenario that was tragic, what happened with Kevin Carter, right?
Oh.
With a vulture and then a basically starving little girl. And it turns out that that's compressed because of a zoom lens. So it looks like the vulture is right behind this girl ready to attack her and eat her. And Kevin Carter won a Pulitzer Prize and then committed suicide the next year.
Yeah, because he was accused of not helping this child who was crouching down in an African country. I don't remember where it was. And a vulture looked like it was about to eat the child, but they were actually quite separated. So he was unfairly besmirched by that. And you can say the same thing about me if you want, but hopefully I've given you enough evidence where you can see that there are people that I've photographed who did make it, who wanted to make it, and they made up their own minds. It was their choice. Yeah. I'm reminded that journalistic integrity is what makes it. If this was a mockumentary or a Hollywood movie or somebody encouraging someone to stick with them, like most migrants wouldn't, and there have been so-called documentary films made, and I know they cheated. If that happened to me, maybe you wouldn't believe anything. You wouldn't believe that kid was sitting all alone there, or did I ask him to sit there? Yeah, would you believe it? So I could not take one slight little, mistake, and I certainly didn't. But that's a very good question. Thank you.
Yeah, Jonathan, really good question. Anybody else have questions? Just bear that.
You said a lot of your job is about gaining the trust of the people that you're photographing. So I wanted to ask, how do you do that? And also, would you say, in your experience, there was more or less reluctance to going on camera as opposed to talking to a reporter?
Yeah, the camera was always my biggest impediment. If I could roam around with a pencil behind my ear and my hands in my back pocket, nobody would give a shit. They would probably talk to me. But a camera is, in some countries, it's more dangerous than a gun because it captures your being, your emotion, your face, your identity. So I was always careful to explain, like I said a little bit earlier, who I was, who I worked for, why I was doing this. And those who felt like, oh, the camera is too much of a risk for me, they would take off. And I wouldn't pursue them. And I wouldn't pay any attention to those who were mugging for the camera. Because somewhere in between was the truth.
But it seemed that most of your photos were candid. So
All of them were.
Okay, but so then how did you explain that you're a photographer, journalist, and all that jazz if you were shooting? I mean, candid.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well-
you were basically just shooting, right?
Yes. The question was, how did you manage to capture candid moments if people knew who you were? Well, I would spend 10 or 12 hours with the same group of people on the train. So inevitably, they would not care about me and care about where they're going to get a drink of water or a bite to eat or how they're going to evade capture. So there was I wasn't important in their life
At the
anymore.
time.
Yes, yeah. Believe it or not, more than the digital camera, the film camera, the computer, the airplane ride, the ticket, more valuable than that was time. And the LA Times gave me all the time I needed, and I took 3 months to do this. Yes?
Is there anything that you witnessed on your journey that you felt like you weren't able to capture, like an emotion or something that you just couldn't get into a photo?
There was. There certainly was. Okay, the signature picture of the boy sitting alone, the train disappearing into the fog. I had photographed a vertical and a horizontal, and then in my camera side pack, I started to pull out my journal. I was going to ask the boy some questions, and I told some of Scott's students this earlier, but the boy was shaking like a leaf. He was shivering and just quivering, and he was sniffling. And he would, how when an infant or child or a young person will cry so much that they can hardly catch their breath, there's a glottal stop. That's what he was doing. And I looked at him and I had this instant memory of when I was ambushed by an adult when I was having a good cry in earlier years. And I said, oh God, I can't do this to him. So I stepped back and I did not get his name. I did not get any circumstances, but all of my photojournalism is supported and backed up by circumstances that I can write about, except for that one. And I don't think it needed any either. And I could not, I could not bother them. Now, it wasn't like somebody who was injured or somebody who was dying of thirst or hunger. It was an emotional jolt for me. So I backed away. Yeah.
Don, which was tougher, being in Vietnam or being on the beast?
Well, a border patrolman, when I was early in my career, were roaming along the U.S.-Mexico border in San Ysidro. He said, this is kind of like a war here, we got our guns, we got our flak jackets. I said, yeah, it kind of feels like that. As a matter of fact, the man who runs the shelter way down south in the most southern part of Mexico, Father Fleur Rigoni, he told me, he said, this is a war. This migration is a war without name, because there are insurgents, there are invaders, these are not my terms, the people going in other places, and there are impediments, there are armed people, there are people with stones and rocks and fists, and so it's kind of like that.
Which was scarier?
Scarier? Well, Vietnam was very scary because I never saw the enemy. I could feel what he was throwing at me. And I was around a lot of other people. Thank God I was with other people, or I'd still be walking around in circles in the jungle because I have a terrible sense of direction. But when I was on the beast, I knew I was going to go north, and eventually all I'd do is hang on, and I would be there as long as I would keep observing. But no, getting on the train, it sounds insane, doesn't it? I mean, it just sounds like a crazy thing to do. But after a while, and some of you young people are going to do like some of us veterans, you're going to be in your job that seems like a job you're never going to get when you're a youngster, but when you're actually doing it as an adult, this is simple. Well, getting on and off a moving freight train became simple to me. And it's a good thing, because then I could concentrate on why I was getting on and off that train, and that was to be a reporter. Yeah.
So I assume you don't need permission from people to publish these pictures.
No, they're in a public place. Yeah, but I always tried to get names,
Yeah.
and I've stayed in contact with some people.
So I wonder, when you do get names and you're meeting the people, do you ask them or do you tell them, I'm gonna publish these pictures?
Always.
Is it okay? Do you
I-
ask them? Do you say to them? Is
I
it
do.
okay? And I also wonder if, so for dead bodies in particular, do you feel like, for instance, a girl,
There are not.
with the parents or the grandparents, do you feel any kind of extra responsibility, and do you ask them permission, or do you, I don't know, do you feel anything?
Well, I do. We wouldn't publish a face of a dead body, except the little 7-year-old girl
Yeah.
laying on the autopsy table. The parents of that child, when I approached them in the morgue chapel, I told them what I was doing, who I was, and they said, we stood outside the chapel later on, and they said, yes, you can publish these pictures. I want you to tell our story. Nobody in this country is telling it. The police are corrupt, the army is corrupt, the government is corrupt. Nobody cares about us. You tell the story, and I'll be here to answer your questions. And they gave me carte blanche, and I could photograph the most horrible things I've ever seen in my life. But no, I would not. When I was in the South Texas desert, I saw the faces. In the case of the woman whose arm you only saw her arm, she had no ID. So she was probably a Central American and trying incognito. That's a good question. Yeah. Yes, sir.
How are you, my friend? How are you?
Me?
Yeah, how are you?
Yeah, I'm great.
You're good. Just to see all this stuff and to be there, and it must affect you.
Yeah, it does. I preach and I drone on and on about how I'm a neutral observer, but inside it doesn't work that way. It is impossible not to feel something, and it is difficult not to do anything. But the published pictures and the stories have affected immigration policy, farm worker policy in California. So yeah, how am I doing? I'm happy that I did what I did when I was younger, because it's the never-ending story and it's still going on. I think it probably started, I'm not an anthropologist, I'm not a cultural intellectual, I'm not half as smart as most of you, but I think that migration for survival started with the caveman, with the people chasing the herd over the horizon. Now people are still chasing the almighty dollar over the horizon. So it's human nature, it's happening, it's always going to go on. So I can get off the soapbox, that's the last I'll say. But all of you deserve to have an opinion, and you can look at these and say, yeah, whatever you want to feel. Did you have a question back here?
Yes, sir. I would say a vast majority of these photos, you've put yourself physically in a dangerous position, whether on a moving train, in gang member territory. How did you, as a young photojournalist, have that level of risk acceptance and say, I'm okay with putting myself in physical danger in order to tell this story? What was your thought process?
Yeah. Well, I'm not brave. I'm not a hero. I don't take a step without the advice of this incredible research institute called the Los Angeles Times, with our correspondents all over the world, giving me hints and contacts and advice and warning. Of course, no other photojournalist has done what I did on the trains. But I knew when danger was there. In fact, there was a Marachucha gangster who came out of a thicket while I was waiting for the train to move out of a freight yard in the middle of Mexico. And I could instantly tell he was not a migrant because his pants were down to here and he was swaggering. Yeah, Joe, I gotta finish this story.
You're my hero, John.
That'll cost you a beer. Yeah, well, let me finish this story because this is as close as I came to death. Not falling off the train, but having the guy chop my fucking head off with his machete. So this guy came out of the thicket and he came up and he reached in his sagging jeans and I says, oh God, I hope he doesn't have a pistol and he wants my cameras. And he slowly slid this fucking machete that was this long out of his pant leg. And he started banging it on the rail. And all the migrants who were just about to jump on the train thinking it was about to leave, they jumped off like mice and disappeared. Because they knew he was one of those gangsters who were going to board the train and parade up and down with his cohorts who were probably on different parts of the train and rob them. So I said, oh, you wouldn't happen to be the famous Blackie, would you? Blackie was a notorious a gangster in that part of Mexico. And he looks at me, he kind of sneers, and I said, hey, Blackie, I'm doing a real important story here, and I think you're part of it. Why don't you let me make a beautiful portrait of you? And, he looks at me like, you fucking crazy? So I said, well, I didn't want to end up like Daniel Pearl either, but I was right in front of something I didn't know if I could control or not. And I said, you should let me do this because nobody can do it better. And then by the grace of God, the train horn blew and the train began to move. I could hear all the couplers tightening up. Bam, 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 bam. And he looks up and migrants began to come out of the thicket and jumping on. And I told him, hey, Blackie, sorry, we're gonna have to give me a rain check on that portrait session. I gotta go. So I wobbled away on the rubble of the roadbed, and I didn't want to run, but I did look back, and he jumped on the last car of the train. So that was a close one. No pictures of that. Had I pulled out a camera and actually shot one, he probably would have done me in.
Yeah, a great film to watch to give some context about is Sin Nombre, Without a Name. It kind of has a similar theme, but it's a love story too, and melancholy, but super violent too, but there's some machete stuff going on in that one. It's been a wonderful afternoon. Thanks for the questions. Thanks for your talk, Doc. And thank you for coming.